video we're going to look at how to make the parts for your balancing toy. And we have your working drawing completed, of course. This one's been blown up so that it is A3 at full size. You drew it at A4, we'd have to put that on the photocopier to get it to this size. This means that I can measure straight from this drawing with my steel ruler, and I can work out what length everything needs to be to make my balancing toy parts. I'm going to start with probably the simplest part, which is this spike here. So we need to get that cut and filed so that it's got a point on the end. So we're going to start by looking at the tools that I would use to do that. Now remember, we're cutting this 3mm mild steel bar. It's quite thin, it's not difficult to cut. Some of the materials you would use for the stand, for instance, would be a bit trickier, but this is fairly simple. I'm going to cut it after I've marked it to length. So I'll measure the length from my working drawing. It's 25mm, and then I'll measure it onto this piece of steel that I have here. And I'm just going to use a Sharpie for this job because we don't have to be massively accurate. If I needed to be really accurate, I would use a scriber, of course, for marking out metals, but a Sharpie's fine. So I now have my piece of steel bar with a mark on it, and I'm going to cut on this side of my line, just on this side, so that I'm not going to remove the line, I'm not going to make it too short. It's going to be able to be filed back to the right size when I've cut it. To do that, I need to clamp it in a vise, and I clamp it so that there's a little bit of room for the saw blade to go. It's not right against the vise. And the tool I'm going to use to cut my piece of steel is a hacksaw. And a hacksaw has very small teeth, which means that you can cut hard materials like steel, unlike a tenon saw, which we used in woodworking projects, which have much bigger teeth and wouldn't be able to cut the mild steel. I'm going to take my hacksaw and I'm going to just run it along my thumb just to get where I want it to be, and it will make a little groove in the steel. Once it's made that little groove, I can get two hands on, because a hacksaw is a two-handed tool, and I can then cut nice smooth action using the whole blade until it pops off. So that is the blank piece of steel to make my spike from. You can see that the end is quite rough, so I'm going to need to file that, and then the other end I'm going to need to put a point on. And the tool I'm going to use to do that is a file. This is a 6-inch file. It's got a fairly smooth cut, but it's a flat file. It's a rectangular shaped blade on it. To file my steel, I'm going to clamp it into the vise, and I like to always file horizontally. So I'll always clamp my work so that I'm filing horizontally. Let's do the top end first, which needs to be just flattened off. So I'm clamping it just above the jaws of the vise, two hands again on the file. And we can see that is now nicely flattened off compared to what it was. Okay. Now the other end I'm going to put a spike on, and to do that I'm going to clamp it in the vise at an angle and still file flat like this. So I've done one side, so you can see that, done one side. I'm going to flip it over and do the same on the other side. So I'm essentially going to file 4 faces onto it. Then I'm going just going to rotate it in the vise so I can file the other two sides. And just flip it over. And you can see I've now created a four-sided pyramid type point on the end of that. So that's my spike. So that can go into my drawing now. One part done. The next thing I'm going to make is the balance bar, which is a straight piece of steel with a sharp bend in the middle of it. Okay, so I'm going to get a piece of steel and mark a bend and then bend it in the vise. Good idea to pick steel off the floor in case anyone steps on it and goes flying. So I've got my length of steel now. I know that the bend has to be in the middle, so I'm just going to mark the middle with my Sharpie, and I'm going to put it in the vise with that bend, with that mark, just at the edge of the jaws. Now, I could bend it by hand, but I'm likely to get a slightly uneven bend if I do that, so I'm going to use a hammer to hit it. Now, the hammer we use in metalwork is called a ball peen hammer because of this ball-shaped end on it, but we're going to use the flat surface, the normal surface, today. So it's clamped in the vise, and I always hit horizontally. I never hit downwards when I'm bending, otherwise it'll just move in the vise and scratch the surface. So I'm going to hit it and bend it to the shape I want. So I've got roughly a right angle so far, but it needs to be more than that. So I'm going to just tilt it up in the vise just to finish that off. And there we go. So that's the second piece of my balancing toy made. Now, to make these curved sections, we need to use a slightly different technique. We can't just hit it in a vise because we'll get corners. So we need to use something to bend it around. And that is called a former. So this is one of the formers that we have. And it just clamps into our vise. Nice and tightly because we're going to be hitting it. And then we'll get a bit of steel. Now you need to have a longer piece than the piece you want to end up with when you're making curves. Otherwise it's really hard to hold on to. If you have a little short bit and you try and hit it, it's very, very difficult. So I've got a longer piece of steel here. I've got my ball peen hammer again. And I'm going to hit it just over from the centre. If I hit it on the centre, nothing happens because I'm just hitting it onto the metal. But if I hit it just beyond, then the tip of it will actually bend down into the gap. You see it starting to bend. So if I keep hitting it, you can see that it will start to create a curve. Now obviously I can't make a smaller curve than the diameter of this former, so if I want something tighter than this, I would need to use a much smaller diameter of steel bar. But that's one way of making curves in steel, and then I'll just cut that off at the right point, cut the excess away. Once I've done all that, I will have all the parts for my design. I've made all the parts, I've laid them out on my sheet, so I know that they're the right size. I can see that they make the shapes that I want because they're laid out on the working drawing. And it'll be ready for brazing. And finally you can see the parts that we've cut and bent laid out on the working drawing, ready for brazing. The weights haven't been made yet. This isn't made from 3mm steel. This central column would cut that from 8mm bar, and the base of course is made of MDF. But all the parts that require brazing are laid out like this to check that they're the right size and the right shape and that they go together as we want them to. So remember the tools that we used for these processes. We started with a steel rule and a Sharpie to mark our steel and get the lengths that we want based on our working drawing. And then we used a hacksaw to cut it to length. Remember, a hacksaw has very small teeth. Then we filed the ends with a file to get the ends flat or to make the point for the spike. And then we made a bend for the balance bar by hitting it in a vise with a ball peen hammer. We used the same hammer to make a curve by hitting it on a former, which was clamped in a vise.